very much. It's, there are various, obviously, as all of the panelists, including Prince Asfausa and Professor Edvestel and all of you mentioned, there are various exogenous and endogenous factors that make Ethiopia vulnerable to this crisis that we're seeing. Namely the Ethiopian Constitution, which divided the people along ethno-linguistic lines and granted the right to self-determination up to secession for each and every ethnic region, is something that we should keep in mind. The military apparatus and the special, these so-called special forces are also divided along ethnic lines and essentially incentivized by the Constitution to fight against each other. So this keeps Ethiopia in a perpetual state of conflict and incentivizes the disintegration of Ethiopia as opposed to the integration, the peace and the unity of the people. So this is something that's very important. Having said that, I noticed that Dr. Tsahai also joined, and Dr. Tsahai is someone who we very much appreciate and would like to give the Q&A time to her to briefly introduce herself. She did her PhD in philosophy in Oxford, has a background in history and a specialization in social anthropology. Dr. Tsahai was one of the 40 professors who was actually ousted by the TPLF from Addis Ababa University, formerly Haile Selassie First University, and has written numerous publications and has authored a book as well. So without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Tsahai to provide some remarks.
Thank you very much. I apologize for not being able to handle the technology earlier to get us into this August webinar on good time. Thank you for giving me a chance now. This is abnormal, but it's going to be very good because it's innovative to have the keynote speech at this stage. I think it's good. It's all right. Well, I was going to make the point that Ethiopia produces its own problems, sometimes hiding its own solutions, but definitely all the time ready with its solutions if one were to scratch the surface. So far, the problems it has produced for itself, such as famine, pestilence, disease, drought, which could be managed better than it is, that has been handled so far, is one of them. One of the major things that has given us a stereotyped image. Ethiopia, oh, that famine country, that famished people, those famished people, stereotyped. One stereotype that developed in the 1970s to the 1990s was that Ethiopia was a starving country of people of starving population. But there was a lot of food. It could have been managed better. The population could have been handled better, etc. Despite the drought, and the drought. And that's why I say it generates its problems, but it has solutions right under the surface. But we are left with this stereotype. The other stereotype we now have is that it is devolving into ethnicity from a nation down to ethnic division. Ethiopia has been a nation for 2,000 years. One of its major assets in that, which is hiding on the surface, is the state. It has a nation state. People seem to ignore that, to forget that. There is a nation state. The nation state that can, if handled properly, accommodate all ethnic groups, religious groups, and what have you, in terms of divisions of the population. People cannot be, must not be one, the same everywhere. This is not one. But we have the good diversity that, if put to use, could be really a springboard for development, whatever it is we want in the 21st century. So, this stereotype of ethnic conflicting people who probably don't know how to manage themselves, or what is the state up to? What's the state doing? Is it really, has it always been a nation state? No, it has never been a nation state. Some protagonists of this ethnic devolution are wanting to say. But I insist it has always accommodated ethnic groups and diversities. It's capable of doing that. I'm not calling for a monarchy. There's no need for any form of government for a state to function properly. Distinction must be made between government and state. The state is there. All it needs is an appropriate government to run the diversities. And why do we have... and the third thing I would like to say is we can combine these two stereotypes into something beautifully constructive. Yes, we have ethnic groups inside Ethiopia. Yes, there are some who are making a lot of noise about not being in power. We want to be in power. It's now that Tigray have gone, the Oromo want to come. No, perhaps the Aramara want to come. No, perhaps the Walaita want to come to the center of government. That's not it. No. What we could do is really dig back into our background. What was holding the nation together as a nation state? Is a nation state? Can the nation state hold itself together with this diversity and with all the poverty going on? Yes, it can. After all, ድህነት ቁምጥና አይደለም. I'm not sure if I want to translate that, because there is, when you say one thing positive, something negative comes. Poverty is not leprosy. Leprosy is not a bad thing that should be condemned like that. But it is to say, you don't need a medical doctor to get out of poverty. You can get out of poverty if you manage yourself properly. And this is an Ethiopian wisdom that could be used to convince those who think that the country is poor and cannot eradicate this poverty. There is no need for dependency on aid. There is no need for hankering after people who give us aid. I'll tell you why I say that. In 2001 or thereabouts, no. In 1984, there was famine. And somebody organized a song and dance. Can you imagine singing and dancing about poverty and hunger and famine? Bob Geldof did. He sang and danced about it. No, I've never forgiven him for that. And I'm joking. He really raised a lot of money. And he was preparing to go out to Ethiopia to distribute that money. He called for a breakfast meeting with journalists. Even though I have had a doctorate from Oxford University, I was working as a journalist in spare rib. So I joined that breakfast meeting with Bob Geldof. Said I, Mr. Geldof, I could help, I'm Ethiopian. Oh, he said, we don't need Ethiopians, we have an anthropologist. I'm an anthropologist. I have already got my own anthropologist, British. Ouch. Well, left the meeting. I had a call from Daily Mail. Would you like to take him up on that? Mr. Daily Mail, no thank you very much. Has raised money for Ethiopia. Let him get going. What hurt I have received from his statements can stay locked up. Until today, I've kept it locked up. That attitude of saying we know better for getting you out of poverty, it produced a lot of money, but it hurts, and that's wrong. There is something wrong about that. There is something wrong about that. Can we not raise the money ourselves? We can. Ethiopians can raise the money, all the gold, all the agricultural goods, whatever is in Ethiopia, can be put together to produce that amount of money to see us out of the famished area here, there, and everywhere around Ethiopia where drought has affected it. It can be done. Dependency on aid and getting Westerners to help us on that basis is probably something that should change. Westerners react. In that instance of Bob Geldof raising money, they reacted beautifully. The amount of money he raised, in the first instance, he raised $500,000 in just, a couple of weeks. Absolute response with sympathy and empathy for the people, starving people of Ethiopia. People in the West are kind. But then Mr. Geldof, being him, brushing me off, we don't need Ethiopians, for we are anthropologists, is symptomatic of we know better for you type of attitudes that some Westerners adopt. Well, we should get away from that. We should help Westerners to be empathetic, sympathetic, and get on with relating to us through diplomacy rather than through vulnerabilities. Our vulnerabilities are manageable. We could handle them, we can handle them. And that's one thing we should be looking forward to. How do we get out of our vulnerabilities? And how do we manage them so that we're not dependent on the West, so that we are independently managing our society and our economy and our politics? Okay? So then, what about okay, just one sec, Legion the ethnic conflicts, there are resources, endless resources of reconciliation processes in Ethiopia. That is one thing that Ethiopians are all proud of, reconciliation processes. We already have them in place. We could utilize them. We could remove partly because these ethnic conflicts are artificially stimulated now. They didn't exist on the ground. While some people are killing the Amhara, the other side, why are we killing our neighbors? Why are you killing our neighbors? I mean, it's not on the ground. It's artificially stimulated. It's about time that it gets handled. From right now, it should be handled and got rid of. We can do it as Ethiopians. What can Westerners do? Help that along. Rather than supporting this or that liberation front, help Ethiopia to exploit its own reconciliation processes and solve its ethnic conflict, problems of ethnic conflict. These are the kind of things I wanted to say. And I'm hoping that this conference will come up with this kind of positive, what can we do from the West, towards Ethiopia, helping Ethiopian out of its stereotyped and artificially created difficulties and problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Tsai, for your insightful remarks. I would like to also add that, reconciling ethnic differences is obviously very important, but I think also it's very important to mention the need to reconcile with our own history. Some anti-Ethiopian use Ethiopian history to 100 years. Some say 2,000. Some say 3,000. I think I would say Prince Asfaw is living proof of the continuity of a monarchy that held Ethiopia's territorial integrity intact, and its people under one nation, one flag for thousands of years. So I think it's this important point to mention, the need to also reconcile with our history and also be forward looking as well. Having said that, I think we're now overdue for the second session, which will be moderated by His Imperial Highness Prince Asfaw Asarata Kasa. Session 2 will be Western interests and reactions to the current crisis. I will leave the floor to Prince Asfaw.
Thank you very much indeed, Lieutenant. I now have the pleasure of introducing the two panelists who are going to be Mr. Jeff Pearce and Professor John Abing. I think we should start with Mr. Pearce. I hope, Jeff, you can hear me. Are you there, Jeff?
Jeff, unmute yourself, please.
I'm sorry. Sorry to interrupt, but wasn't Mrs. Ana Gomez not one of the speakers?
Yes.
Unfortunately, she's not there. Well, at least I don't have
She is here.
Oh,
She has been here.
Oh, well, why didn't I get that? So would you like me to start with Her Excellency, Mrs. Gomez?
I'm happy to defer to Ms. Gomez.
Please do that.
Okay, shall I do so?
Doesn't matter.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I'm very sorry. I had got a different program. That is why I didn't have you on my list. Your Excellency, what a great pleasure it is to see you again. I had the pleasure of meeting you many years ago in Strasbourg when I came to address the European Parliament on a session of the European Council. And Her Excellency Mrs. Ana Gomes is a Portuguese former diplomat and politician of the Socialist Party. From 2004 to 2009, she served as a member of the European Parliament, where she was an outspoken campaigner on corruption or against corruption and for human rights. I know that Madame Gomez also campaigned vividly to secure the release of the Khalid prisoners during the TPLF era, for whom we are extremely grateful. She has been a true advocate of democracy and civil liberties all her life, and it's a great pleasure to have you here with us today, Your Excellency. I should say, the air is yours.
Thank you so much, Princess Wilson. It's a great opportunity to be with Ethiopian friends, and I'm really learning a lot through the statements that I've already heard today from yourself and all the other speakers. And it's great that you are organizing this initiative. I'm one of the Westerners who actually states that it doesn't know much about Ethiopia. I don't pretend to know much about Ethiopia. The little I know, I've learned the hard way in Ethiopia in 2005, in the year when I served as the head of the European Election Observer Mission to Ethiopia. And I do very well understand what several speakers have spoken about, the realization that you're in front of a nation state, of a civilization of major importance, not just for Africa, but behind, and how indeed different ways to divide and rule have been crippling that incredible nation. And in that year of 2005, I think actually the views of our mission, which I published, very much coincided with the mission that was headed by President Carter on behalf of the Carter Center during the election observation in Ethiopia. And I think President Carter and his team, just like ours from the European Union, as we went, we slightly changed our view. I mean, we definitely changed our perception. And that was thanks to what we were watching on the ground, and in particular the extraordinary commitment of people to vote in those elections. I think these were very special elections because in the end people came to massively vote, and the results were so stunning for the dictatorship of Meles Zenawi that he had immediately to put a stop to the counting, and to, in particular, the results probably in Addis Ababa were the only ones you can rely on. Then the rest was, of course, fabricated. And in my interaction throughout that period with Meles Zenawi himself, with his ministers, and with the people, different opposition leaders, I realized, and all our staff, we had a mission of about 200 people, how the European Union was actually caught in a situation that it had crafted itself, a very conflicting situation. The European Union was definitely, I mean, I definitely understand what people like yourself, Princess Wilson, and Professor Tehaya said about this European colonialist rule to divide to rule. and the way tribalism was indeed used. And then, of course, they found it in the TPLF and in Meles Zenawi a way to impose that rule or to absorb that rule. I remember when we arrived in Addis in 2005, Meles himself was one of the people spreading the ghost that Ethiopia could turn Rwanda, and was waving the threat of the Radio Mille Collines to actually silence the opposition, to prevent the opposition from doing their work in a democracy. And at the same time, I and we are observers from the European Union, and I always say that when I left to Ethiopia, I was given a report about the situation that painted everything in, I always say, in pink and light blue. You know, everything was marvelous. You had a country that was moving into a genuine transition for democracy, where our role was going to be very important to indeed enable that. And then we realized that actually they expected us to be there to rubber stamp a very controlled exercise. And since the exercise got out of control, then they wanted us to rubber stamp what was the permanence in power of that oppressive regime. And of course, the threats being what I was hearing from the headquarters was, well, the threat is that Ethiopia could disintegrate, you know, and then you imagine the repercussion for the whole of Africa. So you have this combined threat, and I think it was really important to be in Ethiopia, to be linking with the people, to be talking to the people, and I will never forget how instructive it was for me to get out even of the main electors and to go out in the mountains. I remember getting out of Gondar and going through the mountains and asking shepherds, do you know there are going to be elections? What do you expect? And so on. These were the most illuminating inputs into our assessment of the situation. And I saw that, and I still think that the European Union was very much caught in its game, also because of, indeed, aid being a tool as well, as Professor Tahai was saying, for a double tool, so to say. A tool for Meles to keep the oppression, and at the same time to keep the foreigners with a vested interest in his regime. It was, for me, quite schizophrenic, so to say, the approach. I had to deal with two main departments in the European Union, in Brussels. One was at that point, the High Commissioner for External Relations. It was Commissioner Ferrero-Waldner. She was the one who actually called me and said that she asked me to do this job because you're independent, you have no connection whatsoever with Ethiopia, and you are an experienced diplomat. That's what she said. And it was true. I had no experience no connection whatsoever with Ethiopia. And she told me, and you'll be independent. You are having this mission, you're going to see it independently. And I must say, she was always, she lived up to that promise. And it was actually the part of the EU that I felt supported me throughout that very complicated process. At the same time, I had to deal with the so-called aid, development commissioner, development apparatus, which were the people with the vested interest, and they wanted it to keep going. They were not really interested that things would really change. They wanted to keep going. There was a lot of industries of the development aid in the different member states, but in particular UK, Germany, also France, who wanted things to go on. And they were the ones who wanted to cover up for the narrative of the regime. And they were the ones with whom I had big trouble. They were led by Louis Michel, at that time, the commissioner, who was actually a great friend of Meles Zenawi himself personally, to the point that I think that Meles later died actually in his hands, so to say. I mean, while he was in Belgium with the assistance of Louis Michel. And it was schizophrenic for me and my team to deal with these guys. They really wanted us. They tried even to rewrite our reports, our final reports, and my people said no. And fortunately, I had the backing of Commissioner Ferreira-Waldner. But this shows the schizophrenia. And so this leads me to say that indeed there's Western responsibility, and Ethiopia should get rid of it. I mean, I very much agree with what Professor Tehaya said. Ethiopia has the strength to be on its own, to find governance. Maybe you don't have too many means, but you will find means. You will diversify sources. I would say it's not right as well to put yourself in the hands of the Chinese or of the Saudis or whoever. Multiply the support in different areas, aid in other areas, but don't let anyone take a position that will rule. And also in what concerns the US. I must say, one of the great disappointments I had in this period, right after the elections, and then remember there were a repeat of some elections for them to fabricate the results and all that. And when they arrested all the opposition members, candidate members and so on, I was afraid that they would kill many of the people. And so I was trying to develop all sorts of links and used, namely, I went all the way to the UN, spoke with the Assistant Secretary General for Africa, not really helpful, but also went to the State Department. And actually my luck was to find a fantastic person in Congress, the late Donald Payne, who really helped, who understood what was at stake and helped with hearings in Congress. But in State Department, I was really disappointed. They had a new, it was in the days of the George W. Bush administration, there was a new Assistant Secretary of State for Africa. She knew nothing, poor lady. Maybe she later learned, Jendai Fraser. But I remember who was with her was this other woman, Gail Smith, who was awful. I'm sorry, I know that later she was in Ethiopia, but it was not at all what I would have expected for someone with a background on US, from USA. That she was obviously bought into the TPLF propaganda. And she was totally dismissive of what I was telling them about my concerns, that indeed the opposition would be killed and so on. So I think that kind of tension also exists in the different US administrations. And I think she was obviously, she was Democrat, she was close to Obama, who played, I think, also a very important role later when he was president. But with these tensions are still there. So one more reason why it's important that Ethiopians know how to read this, but indeed take pride and take their strengths into their hands and their fate into their hands. And yes, it is about Ethiopian governance, so that indeed Ethiopia will be independent, will assert its own strategy for development. It's now, of course, with this, and I could go back just to 2005, the catalogue of atrocities and tricks against the opposition or to silence opposition that Professor Theodor Vestal described is exactly what I saw. I will never forget when in 2005 I went to Ankobar, just 15 days before the elections, and Meles Zenawi, who encouraged me to go to Ankabar to find out what was happening, because we had a lot of reports that terrible things were happening. He encouraged me to go, and then he organized a number of fake opposition so that when I would go there, as I did, the people talking to me were fake opposition. Were people pretending to be the local opposition leader. I was able to find the local opposition because someone tipped us, and we were able to find them hiding in a church somewhere in the region and so on. But it was to this extreme. And yes, about the constitution. I remember, I understand that indeed this problem with the constitution is really serious because it's about this ethnic federalism, which is the tool for this rule of divide and to rule. It has to change. I don't know if the solution is to get rid of the whole constitution or to indeed find a majority in parliament to review the constitution and get rid of the worst parts. Because it's true that on human rights, there are good parts in the constitution. And I remember I myself writing to Meles Zenawi, quoting the constitution. He was all the time quoting the constitution to me, and I was quoting to him the constitution to actually tell him, you are violating the rights of your people, and according to your constitution. So the constitution has some good parts that probably are not to get rid of them, but some nasty parts, namely those parts which are the basis of this nasty ethnic federalism, should get rid. Ethiopia should get rid of it. And that can be done in different ways, probably in parliament with a review of the constitution if there is a qualified majority for the future. And of course, I've been not following very closely, but of course, listening to all the international media. And also, of course, now that the way that social media are being used by the propagandists of the PLF, it's really nasty, really nasty. And, you know, they really excelled in propaganda. And I could see that. One of my difficulties in all these years, 15 years in the European Parliament campaigning for Ethiopia, the big difficulty was, despite the fact that Ethiopia has so important, able people in the diaspora all over in Europe as much as in the United States, they don't make a difference. The propaganda of the regime was pretty insidious, pretty efficient in buying the main media. And we saw that in 2005, even with BBC. I was a fan of BBC, and after 2005 in Ethiopia, I got much more skeptical about anything that BBC would say, because I saw how they were biased in that campaign in particular. So therefore, under the influence of this very, very efficient and obviously expensive, because it was at paid with Ethiopian money, campaign to spread out. And you see that. I see some of the same propagandists still there, very much now spreading the narrative that portrays the regime, the government of President Abiy has the one trigger, and of course Eritrea triggered all the atrocities in Tigray. Of course, it's a war, and in a war, you know that you're going to have atrocities. But obviously, the vision they are propagating is the one that serves the what remains of the PLF, and yet the only way to counter that is not to do the same, or is not to close the region. It's actually to open it up to the media, to the humanitarian NGOs, and allow them all to see and to participate eventually in supporting the effort to address the humanitarian dire situation, but as well the investigation about human rights that is really needed to prevent the escalation, that things will escalate. Because, you know, I think Ethiopians should not should not underestimate the power of that narrative. And countering that narrative, both in Europe and the US, is really very important. And that is something that I would say should be also a task for the Ethiopians abroad. And I hope that this conference will indeed enable that. I think this is all I can say at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much indeed, Your Excellency. This was a fine address. And thank you also for telling us that the relationship between the EU and Ethiopia and also the West would always be on eye level. And that you reminded us to take our fate in our hands, I think is a very key moment of your address. Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Legitimate, any questions for Her Excellency, Madame Gomez?
Yes, so some have come up, so I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Her Excellency, Your Excellency Ana Gomez, for your support for Ethiopia, and really, speaking up and standing up for the truth. It's very much appreciated, and we will always be thankful for that. One of the questions that we received is why do you think a number of EU member states are still committed to the TPLF even after its demise? Is it partly because TPLF was successful in selling to the Western world the anti-Mara narrative, as it did internally to the elites of other ethnic groups? What is the persistent reason for all these European and US politicians to stick to the TPLF no matter what? If I can elaborate a little bit more, I agree that TPLF had an effective propaganda machine, even though they were disseminating false narratives. But I do recall President Barack Obama in the African Union, along with Secretary of State, along with Susan Rice, mentioning that the TPLF won a democratic election by a margin of 100%, and then laughing. So I think it's beyond just being misinformed and the miscommunication or the misinformation campaign of the TPLF. So if you can speak to that, we would greatly appreciate that, and then we can move on to the other panelists.
Yes, that was an excess of zeal on the part of TPLF that totally discredited them at that time. But yeah, I know, I see some of the, it's not only Ethiopians, it's also some Western journalists and scholars who probably they pay, who are still there, very active, and fueling this narrative about what is going on in Tigray now. And if the region is closed, of course, it helps them spread that narrative. So that's why I say the only way to counter that is openness, and and it's probably also the way to ensure that the people who are there to restore authority and order also behave. Because of course, as it was said earlier, I couldn't agree more that democracy is never a thing done, is something that any nation must be doing all the time. I very much agree with that vision. And obviously by having that kind of perception that you need to behave and to project the right image of the country will also help improve the situation there. I can say that I agree that Ethiopia has one of the great assets as well that Ethiopia has is this extraordinary diversity, linguistic, religious, and so on. In a way, Ethiopia, a country with that diversity, is a country for the world today, for the globalized world we live in. And instead of making this diversity a liability, which is what is at the core of the ethnic federalism thesis, it should be possible for Prime Minister Abiy now to indeed put it in a very positive light and make all the Ethiopians proud of this diversity. And of course, this completely excludes any notion of supremacy of Amara or Oromo or whoever. That notion of supremacy of one group over the others has to be fought. It's anti-democratic, has to be fought against. It's also what sometimes, because I see many people are very nationalist, within the different and ingrained in a way that nasty philosophy of tribalism and ethnic and so the notion of supremacy should be eradicated, should be fought. It is something that often is used to discredit those who want Ethiopia strong and united.
Thank you very much indeed. One moment, Engineer Eskel. Can I continue in the old form? That means that I'm going to call on Professor Abing and then Mr. Jeff Pierce. Can I go ahead like that?
Yes, Prince, because we'll do a Q&A at the end of each session. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Now, I have the great pleasure to call upon Professor John Abing. He is a Dutch anthropologist and historian, specializing in the history and cultures of the Horn of Africa, particularly Ethiopia, and is presently engaged as Professor of Politics and Governance in Africa at Leiden University. I dare say he's also the chair of the Researchers' Assembly of African Studies Center in Leiden. Ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who would like to know more about the conflict in the Ethiopian region of Tigray, I highly recommend his latest oeuvre titled The Atlantic Community's Mistake on Ethiopia, which was published by the African Studies Center in Leiden recently. The floor is now yours, Professor Abing.
Unmute yourself.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for your kind introduction. The theme of this panel is Western interests and reactions to the current crises. And the previous speaker has already alluded to her very fascinating experiences as an observer in Ethiopia, as well as to key elements in this Western narrative on Ethiopia. What I also noted is the often rash and often presumptuous responses by Western countries to the Tigray conflict and its aftermath. I will be mainly talking about that, and from there on expand to other crises which the country has been facing. Regarding the central theme of this webinar, the ramifications of Western reactions to the current crisis in Ethiopia, one could say that ramification number one is simply, and this is worrying, that questionable and hasty policy conclusions are drawn in the Western countries based on, often biased and sometimes even false reports in the media, in the social media. The most recent gaffe, I think, was the CNN documentary on so-called execution of unarmed people by the Ethiopian military. I always wonder, where is the homework on this kind of things? It was demonstrably not correct. Well, the outline of the events since November 4 last year are rather clear. Their interpretation is much disputed, is polarized. And the challenge is now to stimulate some kind of new mainstream shared narrative in the global press and among Western foreign policy pundits to forge a constructive way forward. This polarization is bad. It has indeed been rather amazing how the responses and comments in global media and from various foreign ministries have been accusatory to one side. There was also a steady flow of demands: stop human rights abuse, give an unconditional, unhindered, unrestricted, and in fact unsupervised access to all of Tigray, etc. And many reproaches made specifically to the federal government and army. even including talk about so-called ethnic cleansing having occurred. In addition, there were also calls from EU and US circles for negotiations and for unilateral ceasefire, and for what they call a political solution. Of course, these concerns, they have to be seen against the background of pressure from members of EU parliaments, as well as US members of Congress, about these issues, about their concerns about human rights and so forth, and calling their own governments to account on foreign policy. The statements in the media and from foreign offices are important to follow, to closely follow, because they have material consequences and impacts on the development partnership which is supposed to exist between the West and Ethiopia. So these messages, we have seen in the past couple of months, it's often baffling that also reputed media like BBC, the Washington Post, or the New York Times, even The Economist, have often gone along with the flow, producing premature and often, sometimes a bit ridiculous statements and accusations. Sometimes they backtracked and self-corrected, but always well afterwards. It relates perhaps to a fundamental perception of Africa as always a place of problems and misery, which is not a good way forward. Western media seem to expect that also that a war, including this one, is always or should always be totally clean. No human rights abuse, no incident, no rampage. And as one of the previous speakers said, you know, if wars happen, things sometimes go out of hand. I mean, it's regrettable, but we have an unacceptable and horrific instance occurring. Remember the whole tradition in the West. Remember the World War II bombing of Dresden by the Allies, the good guys, in February 41. Remember the gross abuse by French forces in the Algerian War up to 62. Remember the My massacre of US forces in Vietnam, or the Abu Ghraib abuse in Iraq in 2003 and 4. So things happen, and the alleged abuses in Tigray by Eritrean or possibly federal troops, of course, stand to be investigated, absolutely. It happens now by the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the UN Human Rights Commission. And if these abuses happened, of course, they are wrong and to be condemned, to be prosecuted. For reporters, such incidents are often enough to make the rhetorical leap that such abuse is part of a policy. In this case, of the Federal Ethiopian Army. There are no indications that this is true, that this is a policy. A prime example was the accusation that the Federal Army used hunger as a weapon, as even The Economist preposterously asserted on 23 January this year. I find this quite stunning, amazing. What the media also do not understand or do not like to admit is the measure of often unabashed misinformation of certain digital activists, their lack of honesty and integrity, I'm sorry to say, of those who support the ongoing movement in Mekelle, the TPLF. It's remarkable. Their so-called evidence is often taken at face value by media, and I mean doing that is just more than naive. In the end, most such fake stories, and there are many, are dismantled, of course. They are being analyzed and dismantled, as we see happening, but meanwhile they inflict damage. I will not talk about academics who are also joining in the fray sometimes. I find it very embarrassing. Remarkably, many stories do not consider the entire context of the conflicts, nor problems elsewhere in Ethiopia, before or after, we have mentioned in previous presentations. Often they focus on one aspect only, the bad humanitarian impacts and the human rights abuse. We can't deny that there are such terrible problems in Tigray. Many people are suffering. But next to checking the veracity of the stories, many such problems of abuse and killings are occurring in other parts of Ethiopia as well. And, also well before this specific conflict, and even before the current federal government of the current Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, took office. One hardly hears media and policymakers about the horrific events in Matakkal, Wallaga, and other places, or about the tensions now in Afar, in the south, or in the Somali-Oromia border. Many of these clashes were incited, by the way, by pro-TPLF groups and resources. There are so many indications, clear indications for that. Neither much is written in the global media about the lead-up to the Tigray conflict itself, and the missed chances for a negotiated solution, because many, if not all, will be buffed by the TPLF leadership. Very regrettable and unimaginable. I can't understand this. It is hereby uncritically assumed that TPLF and the Tigray people are one, and have always been one. I think that's incorrect. From the very start in the 1970s, there were major controversies and even instances of abuse of Tigrayan people by the emerging TPLF. And while support for the TPLF may still be there in the field currently, and may linger as long as the humanitarian and rehabilitation efforts do not make good progress, Tigray does not equate with TPLF. That assumption, I think, is just mistaken. Moreover, the remaining TPLF leadership, in contrast to media presentations, does not show signs of wanting to collaborate or negotiate in any way. Their course is to call for resistance in any form possible. I think that's a quite immoral call to the people of Tigray these days. So the media misery is serious. We better get used to it that we live in a world of mass-produced fake news, of course, and silly social media communication, which for some reason is taken too much seriously, even by reputed media outlets. So the conflicts in Ethiopia are not only fought on the battlefield, but also in cyberspace, and we should really take that seriously. They are very important. The point is, however, that media and foreign ministries in the West should improve their fact-checking and their contextual interpretation and do their homework before they make policy pronouncements, and they fail on this account very often. There is some indication that the US is reviewing some of its policies by, giving more aid and so forth. They're doing an admirable job in supplying a lot of aid to the Tigray region. So maybe there may be some turnaround. So I wonder also on the work which I did, which was mentioned by Prince Ashra, was on analyzing this whole discourse, how to go forward. What should we do? What should we strive for? Global media presented evidence in reporting should be scrutinized much better. Examples: the analysis of the so-called Axel massacre, or the CNN documentary on so-called extrajudicial executions. Regular, exaggerated, and unchecked media reports about Ethiopia may sell well, and some reports of abuse may be true and are worrying, but one cannot peddle them without checking and getting to the bottom of the stories. In other words, some more research. Second point forward is media and foreign policy makers might improve their communication with the Ethiopian federal information sources, the ministry, the army, and of course hold them critically to account instead of bypassing them, which often happens. A third point is that I personally feel that one should not be an apologist automatically for the Ethiopian government. If critical analysis coincides, however, with or confirms the statements or interpretations of the government, then so be it. The chance of this is, by the way, is greater than in the case of the information supplied by TPLF-linked circles, from my experience. Remarkably, even Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and CNN have been wrapped up by the latter of these circles. By the way, I recommend also an analysis of the Federal Army, on that fake CNN broadcast about alleged execution. There was a video in America of April 10 where he analyzes point by point what is wrong with that video. But CNN broadcast it. Remarkable. Another point is that one should impress upon the Western policymakers and media how much is at stake in Ethiopia at the moment. At what price are we going to put pressure on the country and the government under duress from many sides? Apart from the domestic troubles, Ethiopia has also to reckon with the unreasonable behavior of, for example, Egypt on the Gerd Dam issue, partly translating into Egypt's meddling into the internal affairs of Ethiopia. What is the cost of constant moral lecturing and eternal foreign EU, UN, US visitors to Addis Ababa? It's striking. I might understand that Ethiopian leaders are very busy, doing their job in this time of crisis, instead of having to always take time off and constantly receive the stream of foreign visitors and admonishing them and lecturing them. For example, one instance is EU Foreign Affairs Delegate Pekka Havisto. I think he visited Addis Ababa 2 or 3 times in the past 6 weeks, demanding explanations, wanting information, and so forth. He refused to go to Tigray himself to see the problems firsthand. But you know, the federal government is in circumstances that are extremely challenging on so many fronts. And it better be supported to prevent worse. To come back to the title of the presentation, of my presentation, Beyond Polemics and Conflicts, Reconnecting to Tigray, one should move the discussion about media and foreign policy reflections in the West beyond the issue of conflicts in Tigray. Both media reporting and humanitarian development policy approaches should try and reconnect Tigray and its people, i.e. in partnership with local stakeholders and with the federal government. I think one should recognize that, unfortunately, that TPLF remnants have lost their chance and right to be part of this. So, final point. While the often misleading media discourse on Ethiopia will gradually be dismantled and fade, the real challenges on the ground in Tigray and elsewhere in Ethiopia will become clear and need serious attention. The West, the media, should try to be a part of this and try to restore balance and thus contribute to fostering reconciliation and recovery in the country. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much indeed. And you were absolutely precisely on time, Professor Abing. I agree with you wholeheartedly that the TPLF is not the sole representative of our brothers and sisters in Tigray. And this is not a war against our brothers and sisters in Tigray. It is a war against the evil doings of the TPLF. And I sincerely hope this one day we will move on to the next chapter of our relationship by recognizing that the Tigrayan people are part and parcel of our common Ethiopian destiny. And let us not forget that Tigray is the core center of Ethiopian civilization, the core center of our history, the core center of both our religions, which is Islam and Christianity. Without Aksum, these two religions would not be existent. So in these days, in these hard days, let us also not forget the very strong links which will always be there between our brothers and sisters in Tigray and their brothers and sisters elsewhere in Ethiopia. Thank you very much indeed for your wonderful presentation. Lidnaviat, any questions for Professor Abing?
Not at this time, but we'll have Q&A at the end of the session. So if you